Kæru gestir, velkomin og bæði þeir sem fylgjast með rafrænt og þeir sem eru með hér í dag í eigin persónu. Viðburðurinn fer fram á ensku og skipti ég nú yfir. Dear guests, I welcome you all to the second Fulbright Forum this May. We were inspired by our students on Monday, and this afternoon we're featuring our scholars, and it promises to be, I'm sure, just as interesting. We have heard from a number of scholars over the past months who have already returned to the U.S. And today we're going to hear from the final 6 in this last Fulbright Forum of the academic year. Some of our scholars have already come to nearly the close of their grants and will be leaving in the next weeks. But some of the scholars who will be speaking today aren't quite at the end yet, but we wanted to give them this opportunity to speak now because we know that once we get into summer, having this kind of event doesn't really work. So first of all, I just want to warmly welcome our fabulous scholars who are going to talk about their experiences in Iceland over the past months. Let me note that the event is being recorded, and those who are joining us virtually can type questions into the Zoom for the individual speakers. So through Fulbright Iceland, we do offer our outstanding scholars an opportunity to grow professionally and as individuals, to share their talents with the Icelandic academic community, to build connections, be inspired, and hopefully go back to the U.S. reinvigorated with new perspectives and ideas. Iceland has a strong academic community, but it is, of course, small in the global context. Thus, bringing in outside knowledge is not only valuable, it is vital. And that's, the reason that we greatly appreciate our U.S. Fulbright scholars and the contribution that they make to Icelandic academia, whether it be through teaching, research, or collaborations and partnership building. Again, we have 6 presentations today, an impressive group from a wide variety of fields. Our U.S. scholar presentation always give food for thought. They're enlightening, they bring interesting perspectives. So no pressure, guys, but we're gonna dive right in. We're gonna start with a few of our Fulbright-NSF Arctic scholars. As many of you know, the Commission has built up an impressive Arctic program in cooperation with partners in the field. And one of our partners is the National Science Foundation in the U.S., with whom the Commission has a unique relationship to bring U.S. scholars and fellows to Iceland to conduct research, both in the natural and social sciences. Great. So next we have Sara Maxwell, who's here also on a Fulbright Iceland NSF Arctic Research grant. She comes from the University of Washington, where she's an associate professor. Her field is environmental science and specializes in natural resource management and policy. She's only been here a couple of months so far, so she's going to be here until mid-July. But we wanted to give her an opportunity to present today, even though she won't have all of her conclusions yet. But she does have a fascinating project involving GPS tracking of eider ducks. I'm going to let her tell you more about it. So come on up, Sara. Where's yours?
Thank you so much for being here and listening. So I'll be talking about protecting Nordic species and culture. And just to give you a little bit of background about me, I consider myself a spatial ecologist. Sometimes I call myself a sustainability ecologist, it varies. But my specialty is particularly in large marine animals. So think birds, sea turtles, seals, whales, that kind of thing. And the focus of my research is to try and understand their movements in particular and apply that to conservation questions. So things like protected areas, offshore wind energy, when that was still a thing in the US, and fisheries management. And the way that I primarily do that is by satellite tracking species. So I joke it's like the equivalent of using your cell phone, gluing it to an animal and then seeing where it goes. So back in the day, the way that we used to like know where animals went was first you put a tag on an animal, then you'd stand out there with your binoculars and get a huge headache for a very long time. And you try and recite the exact same animal. And then we'd know, okay, an animal traveled to this place or that place or this place. But that really left a lot of questions. For example, like what was the path that it took to get there? If you imagine it flying over the ocean, the number of people that would be able to identify that animal would be pretty limited. And then also, once it arrives at its final destination, you don't really know what it's doing when it's there. You know, if it's nighttime, you can't see it. Although if it's summer here in Iceland, I guess you could. But at some point, you do need to sleep. So enter satellite tracking. Particularly with marine species, trying to do that kind of spotting or following animals can be really, really hard because as terrestrial animals ourselves, what we see when we look at the ocean is this. But satellite tracking's really let us understand where animals go in all kinds of complexity, everything from jellyfish all the way to things like whales and little tiny seabirds even. So let's see if this actually works. It may not, we will see. Ooh, it's promising. Yes, okay, so this is a little animation that shows the movement patterns of sooty shearwaters. This little bird here, this is my colleague Scott Schaefer, and he tagged them in New Zealand, and they fly all the way across the Pacific Ocean in the span of a year, and then if you keep watching, they all flood back to New Zealand to breed again. So right now they're out there foraging during the Northern Hemisphere summer, and then back to New Zealand. And so Scott published this in 2006, and at the time, it was the longest migration in the world, and it was literally a few months later, they found out, nope, Arctic terns, they win. And some of those were actually tagged here in Iceland, which was kind of exciting. So, bringing me to Arctic terns. So just to give you a little idea of how I ended up here doing this project, I started working on Arctic terns in 2018 here in Iceland. This was a project funded by Nat Geo that was led by Freydis Vigfúsdóttir, who was then at University of Iceland, and Lucy Hawkes at University of Exeter in the UK. That's Freydis, and that's Lucy, two of my dear friends. And Arctic terns, as I mentioned, are the longest migrators in the world. And so we were looking to understand a little bit more fine-scale information about their movement patterns and that sort of thing. But what's particularly relevant is that we did this work on an Eider farm here in Iceland with Hanna Sig and Palle, who are also now dear friends, and picked up their house for dinner over the weekend. And if you don't know, I know many of you know about Eider farming here in Iceland, but it's the most prized and expensive down in the world. The feathers have these little barbs on them and they kind of stick together, and it makes it so that it just really holds in a lot of heat. Farmers cultivate large colonies of these eiders, which are wild birds, and they do that by protecting them, particularly from things like foxes, unfortunately, and also some invasive species like mink, and then sometimes things like eagles and other birds of prey, or even gulls. So what they do is they actually collect the down, as you know, and then in a lot of instances replace that with hay, which there's been lots of studies that show that that is actually, it's actually preferential for the birds, just because it doesn't, the down also holds moisture when it gets wet, so that's a problem. So we worked at this Eider farm, and as a result, I learned quite a bit about Eider farming in Iceland. What's particularly cool about, I think, Eider farming is that it's this really unique and very, very long-standing cultural tradition. It's often multi-generational, as we were discussing just a few minutes ago, and an important source of rural income. So even the farm where I'm working on, where we did the Arctic tern work, their daughter has just moved back home, is living there on the farm, and is actually starting to take over that work from them. Iceland has the most sustainable approach of Eider farming of all the Nordic countries. Eiders are very well protected by law. Farmers protect and care for these wild colonies. And one of the things that I learned as a result of being on this farm is that the farmers really are super interested in where their birds go. I mean, these are wild birds that they see year after year after year. A lot of times they can kind of identify the individuals They have no idea where they go once they leave. Which imagine you have this relationship with these really important creatures in your life, and you have no idea what happens to them. But one of the challenges is we started having these conversations with them of like, oh, how can we track them? But tracking water birds can be really challenging, and I'll get to that in a moment. Oh, and this is a map of all of the eider farms all around Iceland, so you can see that there are a lot. Oh, okay, I don't know if this is gonna work, but I've got it pulled up on my phone too. So one of the things I think is super, super cool about eiders is the sound that they make. Have any of you heard the sound that they make? Oh, it's so cool. Okay, so let's see if this works. There you go. Okay. Video is a little slow, but they're also doing a little bit of mating displays as well. So the males are the black and white ones, and the females are brown. I know, the bugs being really fabulous. So they make this really cool noise, and this video goes on for a very long time, so I'm gonna pause it, and then let's hope I can get past it, because I've had problems getting past the video. There we go. Okay. So as part of this Arctic tern tracking project, we also learned a lot about the fact that farmers love Arctic terns. The reason that we were working on this farm in the first place is that the Arctic terns actually co-nest with the eiders in a lot of places. So that all their nests are kind of intermingled in here. And Arctic terns, how many of you have encountered an Arctic tern? They are very aggressive. Like, they've actually made me bleed before. So that is a thing. Let's see if this video works. Doesn't look like a video, but so that's me going out to set a trap to try to catch an Arctic tern. And you can see that they are like, it's like the birds out there. Like, it's a little terrifying. And then once I stop, then they're like, oh, now we got a firm target. So I'm actually wearing something on my head so that they're not hitting my actual head, because they will draw blood. So they're very aggressive, so the farmers really like them, because if a predator comes in, then the Arctic terns, man, they are on it. And they're one of the signals that farmers know to look for in case that there's a predator. They're also incredible and sweet little birds, but anyway. Oops, yeah, I did a YouTube video just in case that didn't work, so okay. So as part of, so as this was going along, we completed this project in 2020, and shortly thereafter, Freitas moved to the Ministry of Fisheries. She's in a different office now. They've restructured it all. I forget which one she's in. But what she was seeing was this increase in seaweed harvesting permits, particularly in Brindafurter Bay. And she was starting to be concerned because there's this intersection between seaweed, potential intersection between seaweed and eider ducks. Next slide, yeah. So seaweed makes a lot of sense as a really sustainable product. It grows really quickly. It's a sustainable source of income, especially under climate change, and fisheries are changing, all this stuff. It's low carbon. It can be used for all kinds of things like feed for animals. It can be used for cosmetic products, all kinds of different things. But seaweed, especially Ascophyllum species, which is what's in that picture, it's likely really critical for eiders. And the reason for that is that when they have little chicks, they go into all this seaweed that's along the shore, and they eat things like crabs and little mollusks and things like that are attached to the seaweed. So if you can imagine that if all that seaweed got harvested, that could be a really big problem. And where the permits were being particularly asked for were in places where there's a really high density of eider farming. So you have this cultural tradition that's kind of at odds with this new industry that's potentially blooming. So Freitas reached out to me to help him. Yeah. So the goals of this project in particular are to do like a regime review and just kind of understand what the landscape of different management and laws and things like that are that exist, and just kind of get a sense of how can these things be integrated together. Conduct interviews with eider farmers, seaweed harvesters, and ministerial partners, and also other industries as necessary. Track eider ducks with GPS and accelerometry charts. You knew that was coming. And then also do a reading course here at University of Iceland as well. So I'm still pretty early in the process, but I have done quite a bit on the regime review and also a few interviews, and I've got a whole bunch set up next week when I'm up in Stikisholmer, and I'm super pumped because I keep getting yeses. So one of the big things is that in terms of the seaweed permits, very little has progressed in the last year. As you know, there's been all kinds of change in the administration here, and the freight has got moved around, everything's just changing. So very little has moved forward with it, which is good. And also one of the key things that's come away from my interviews so far is that there's the potential that seaweed harvest is actually not as bad as we thought. I haven't confirmed this yet, but some of the interviews I've had, particularly with one small scale seaweed harvester, suggests that some of the Eider farmers actually prefer some amount of harvest near their farms. And the reason for that is they say it helps basically the chicks be able to access more of those little mollusks and things. If it's too dense, it's too hard for them to get to it, which I thought was really interesting. Oh, and I've got this video if this is going to work. This just shows what one of the commercial scale. We forgot I gotta move forward. This might be a little challenging because I can't see that. Yeah, let's skip that, but you get an idea. This is what the machine looks like. The other thing that's come out of both the regime review and also the interviews is that there are other industries that might even be more harmful, particularly the lumpfish fishery. And this is because they use gill nets as their means of fishing. And if anybody knows anything about fishing gear types, gill nets are very indiscriminate. They tend to catch a lot of other species that they don't intend to catch, which is bycatch, and that includes eider ducks. So if there's, for example, fish or things that are caught in these gill nets, they'll come in, try and eat those, and then get tangled up in the nets themselves. So it can be a really big problem. There are 250 permits for lumpfish in Iceland. The primary use is it gets eaten, but then also the roe is used, like the fish roe is the primary use of them. So that's something that's really big and something we're hoping to have a little bit of information about how deep eiders are diving and be able to overlap that some with how deep they are placing the gill nets and also where. One of the things that's been interesting is that overall, the word has been that eiders are decreasing in Iceland. But what I'm finding in some of my interviews is that eiders are increasing on some farms. So for example, in the south, a number of the farms have said that they've actually seen an increase in numbers in the last few years, which is interesting. And it's a little unclear to me whether or not that's because the eiders are moving and they're ending up at these places and decreasing in other places, or if there's something else going on there, if maybe their numbers are actually going up. And then the other really big thing that I've learned so far is that the ministry is thinking about starting an MPA planning process in Iceland over the next couple of years. So what they're thinking about doing is actually going through the entirety of Iceland and trying to figure out individual places to basically try and create a network of protected areas in their coastal waters, which is a really big deal. And that could be a really good place to insert some of the data that we're collecting here and some of the knowledge that's being put together from the interviews in that. Some of the avenues of protection that have kind of come out of the interviews and the regime review are particularly increasing protections within Brindafjörður Bay, which is up here. And you can see that huge concentration of eider duck farms. And that's also where a lot of the seaweed harvesting, well, it's where it currently occurs in smaller quantities and where a lot of the permits are proposed to do that. There is already an MPA there. It's its own law within Icelandic code, but one of the things about it is that it actually offers very little protection. So there's been this really big push by the Brindafjörður Bay Committee to try and increase protections for this protected area. And they've looked into things like trying to create it as a national park or a World Heritage Site, and as part of those processes, kind of inserting a little bit more about what can and can't be done in this area and some more protections. And they went through this huge process over the course of several years, working with different municipalities and doing this whole thing where they were going from town to town. But the process kind of died out in 2020. Initially, I thought, oh, it's probably because of COVID. But then in my conversations, I learned, no, it was more, there wasn't really that grassroots effort from the towns to really make it happen. And so it's a little bit, it's being tabled at this moment, and it's a little unclear what's going to happen from here. The next thing that we could, that I think is probably the most tangible at the moment, is more proper protections through this MPA planning process that Iceland is planning to do in the next few years. And so incorporating more of the the information and the data and the knowledge from local individuals about eiders and seaweed across all of Iceland. And actually, I just submitted a Nat Geo grant on Monday to hopefully try and do that, to try and bring some of these layers together spatially that includes a lot of the local knowledge. And then finally, there's the possibility of doing something like a large-scale spatial planning process where you really look at all of the different industries and where they're acting on the ground or on the water, and then try and sort of parse those things out. But that process is probably a lot less likely at this point. And I think that the MPA process is the most tangible. You're like, well, where did the eiders go? Well, I don't know yet. So this hasn't happened yet. They've just started nesting. When I was out at the farm on Saturday, they were there were like 2 or 3 of them sitting on nests, which is really exciting. I also saw the first Arctic tern of the season that night. Very exciting too. So we haven't actually done that yet. My tags arrive tomorrow, which is great. So I think we'll probably start in probably about in a week and a half or 2 weeks, give the birds time to kind of settle into their nesting. And we want to track them while they have chicks. So we'll give it a little bit of time. What's really exciting about this is that we're going to try a new tagging method. So the way that people have tracked ducks in the past often has required things like a collar around their neck, or maybe some sort of a harness, or even implanting tags. So actually cutting them open and putting them in, which is obviously not ideal. I don't think I need to go into detail why that is. But we're going to try and do a different method that for some reason seabird people do, but waterbird people don't do. But that's just to use some waterproof tape. And I have found on red-footed boobies that dive from 20 meters into the air and 20 meters into the water, actually stays on really well. So we're going to try this tape method, and it should, I have hope that it's going to work really well and have a lot less impact on the birds. And what we hope to learn are their fine scale movements, particularly when they're feeding, when they have these little chicks, and how that overlaps with the seaweed beds. Then in addition, the tags, it's a really similar tag to what you see here. This is a Western gull that I tagged last year. But the tags also can give us dive depth. So we know, are they actually diving? Are they sitting on the water? Are they flying? So we really have a sense of not only where they're going, but how they're using the space that they're using, which will be really important. And then we'll follow some of the birds to kind of ground truth their behavior as well. I'm going next week up to Stykkishólmur. There's a marine protected area course that University of Iceland offers. That's this really cool field course that they do every year for a whole week up in Stykkishólmur. So I'm going to go and help with that, give some talks and interact with the students. And then the week after that, I'm going to I have a reading course starting on marine protected areas, so kind of a deeper dive into marine protected areas. If any students are interested, let me know. So I'm excited about that. That'll be really cool to be able to engage more in a small group setting with the students, both at the field course and the reading course. And yeah, moving on to the again, the social side of things. This is my son, Jack. He's 8. I have absolutely loved my time here. I love it here. I love it here. And I think one of the things that I have said over and over to people as I've talked to them is that it seems like it's a very different life to be a parent here. I have repeatedly felt and also seen actual evidence that children and families are valued in this country in a way they are not in the United States. Social services and all of the systems are just structured in a way that makes it easier for not just parents, but just humans to function in life. For example, my son goes to Melascoli, and then he goes straight to the after school program. That's like, there's different ways for him to get there. And then he's playing football, soccer. And it's like right next to Frosthamer. And so he can just go back and forth. And it's just like, everything makes sense and it's structured really well. Whereas in the US, you play soccer and you're always driving here and here and here and here, and nobody carpools, and it's just a mess. I've also noticed that children seem happier. The metrics on mental health in kids are phenomenal compared to the US. And it's one of my biggest concerns as a parent, not just for my kid, but for all kids. I know my kids' friends and I love them too. And also it's been my impression that parents seem to enjoy having children here in a way that I think it just filters down to the kids. Parents seem calmer, they seem happier, they seem more supported. It's really beautiful, and also simultaneously makes me really sad for what it feels like in the United States. I've been so excited for Jack to have this experience. He is, as I said, he's going to Melascoli, which is over by the university. His experience has been the kids have been just so welcoming and so interested and curious about him. He loves all the after school programs. He's been learning Icelandic. He's been making friends. This is from Mickey, his best friend Mickey. You can see kids here also love video games. And this is me. Carrie was laughing at me. I was being the parent who was taking pictures of him at recess when I was walking by on my way to the university and being the creepy parent. But it was just so great to see him happy and having so much fun. We've also had a lot of visitors. So for example, my parents run an herb nursery in Florida, and Arturangi, who sells all the herbs and things you see in the grocery stores, they really wanted to go visit. And I was like, okay, this is just in Selfus, so we went. And they had such a great time. So this is the owner of the nursery, and he showed us around and just chatted for an hour and was showing us all the Danish systems that they use. It was so cool. It was so cool. And that was the highlight of their trip. They loved it. And I did too. It was one of the highlights of my trip too. My niece just left today. In fact, my husband and son aren't here today. They're taking her to the airport. And she's from a very conservative part of California. And most of her family has never been out of the country. This is her first time out of the country. And they went to, she came with us to dinner at the Eider farm over the weekend. And they went and hiked on the glacier that Liza was talking about on Monday. They had been there the day before. This is somebody whose family doesn't really believe in climate change and got that experience and saw it with their own eyes. And so when I, see the motto of bringing a little more knowledge, reason, and compassion into the world, that was happening here. So it makes me feel really good. So finally, I just want to say thank you to Melinda and Pieter and Fulbright Iceland and to the whole country for this incredible experience. To all the fellows and scholars, you fellows blew us out of the water yesterday. We were all a little nervous about it. Or Monday, sorry. To Hannah Sigapale, the Eider farmers, to Freitas, and to Jon Gear, who's my sponsor at University of Iceland. That's it. Thank you.
Fabulous, and always so interesting to hear also how it impacts the family, as just as Carrie had talked about, right? So do we have questions? Anybody in the audience want to ask something? I'd maybe just ask again for, bringing a child, how do you think that this experience is sort of impacting him as you go back to the US?
Oh, I think it's I feel like it's really opened his eyes to just kind of life is different in different places. You know what you know. When you grow up in something, it's like you're swimming in the water and you don't even know there's water kind of thing.
Yeah.
So I think it's really valuable in that regard. And I think when I think about it, I'm like, these are this program for him and for the visitors, it's better global citizens. It's basically offering this opportunity. It's making a draw for people to leave their comfort zone. My niece, she's 27, never been out of the country. She probably never would have done that if we hadn't been here. And so that is a huge, huge thing that will have ripple effects through our community and same thing for the sun. So, yeah.
I have a dumb question.
Ooh.
Well, sort of. It's more about the trackers, which I know are gonna start. I think I might have asked before, but to refresh your memory and also for everyone, how long are these trackers staying on the ducks? And then also, like, I think didn't ask this before, like how fine-tuned is it? Is it like within a meter? Is it within 10 meters of the duck's location?
Yeah, so these ones that we're using, so how long they'll stay on, we're a little unclear because this hasn't really been done on these ducks before. I did just recently find a thesis that was buried somewhere where somebody had them stay on for like, it was not very long, it was like a week and a half. And I was like, I can do better than that. But this was a student, and I've done this on lots of different species in lots of places in the world. So I'm hoping for at least 3 weeks, maybe longer. It just depends. It depends a lot on how much they mess with them, honestly. So, and then in terms of how fine scale, they vary actually. So these tags connect with the cell phone network, which is great. You don't have to go all the way. Like I've used other ones where they go all the way to Argos satellites, which is really big error, but these ones are like within a meter.
Wow.
And then the dive depth as well. So it's pretty good, which is what we want, because we want to overlay it with like fine scale maps of seaweed. So yeah.
Yeah, can I just ask maybe, I mean, this is going to be then a continuing cooperation, I would think, based on what you've been discussing. So can you say a little bit about that?
Yeah, so we're still, we're applying for grants to do this on a larger scale, because these tags are expensive. They're like $1,000 a piece. So it's not cheap. It's one of the big downfalls of my field. Some of these things are so expensive. And so, to get a really big sample size, to be able to do this at different farms, et cetera, it takes quite a bit of funding. So my colleague that Freitas and Lucy with the Arctic Tern project. Lucy is a Nat Geo explorer, and she's been talking with Nat Geo about maybe funding more of this. And then I submitted a grant. And our hope had been to apply to NSF for more funding. But I don't know. NSF is, and I'm not even, at this point, University of Washington has suspended the ability to apply for NSF grants as of today. For the moment, anyway. So we'll see. But I mean, I think that I think it'll happen. I think it might just take a little more time.
Exactly. All right, well, thank you so much. We're going to give you your certificate of completion later.
Oh, yeah, that's what.
But for now, we do want to give you a little memento and your Fulbright Iceland pin. You can start wearing it even now while you're on your grant.
Thank you so much.
All right. So, now we're going to move on to hear from Anthony Ives, a professor in ecology at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. So he's been collaborating on ecological research also, but he's in the Lake Mývatn area, and he's been doing work there for a long time. We're very happy that he finally applied for a Fulbright. He's, as I say, doing his field work at Mývatn, hosted by the Mývatn Research Station. He's been here a couple of months now and still has about a month left on his grant. But we can at least hear a little bit about how the project is coming along. He's going to be coming in virtually because he's at Mývatn doing his research, so.
So first of all, sorry for not being there in person, but my project is very, very much ongoing right now. The title's As Winter Recedes and Summer Arrives, which is about now, changes in the ecology of Lake Mývatn. I thought I would give you a brief outline, first talking about long-term work at Mývatn, then talking about winter and spring ecology, and finally, well, this is NSF in part, so basically broader impacts. In terms of long-term work at Mývatn, starting here, the Bedford College student expedition to Mývatn in 1952. They were geographers. Their work didn't have anything to do with what I'm doing right now, but on the right is my mother. The other piece of this story is the Nottingham student expeditions to Skaptefjell, In 1952, my father, who's on the left, hitchhiked up to Mývatn, where he met up with my mother. It was only the third time they met. He actually borrowed the rowboat from Jon Thorlaksson, a local farmer, and rowed my mother around the lake. That started a story, a local story here, that he'd proposed to her during that rowboat. That actually wasn't the case. They'd only met 3 times before, but he did write a letter to her in the fall of that year proposing, and she wrote back, apparently, and said no. It was way too early, but they did eventually get married. So my roots at Mývatn go back a very long way. And in Iceland as well. My father was working at Skaptafet. The farmer was Ragnar Stefansson. He actually sold his farm to the Icelandic government in 1967 to create Skaptafell National Park, which has now been expanded to Vatnajökull National Park. So he sold his farm to the government, but he claimed that it's only the land that he sold, not the ice. So he gave me Mývatn. So if you ever get a chance, if you haven't already, you should go and see my glacier. My work at Mývatn started in 1999 when I met Árni Einarsson. He's the director of the Mývatn Research Station, or RAMI. I met him. He showed me data for midges, Tanni that he'd been collecting, and essentially a collaboration was created instantaneously, just because the data was so remarkable. I couldn't not ask him for a collaboration. I actually didn't start working in Mývatn in person here until 2011, but I worked with Árni collaboratively, mainly with his data. I did visit Mývatn. So Mývatn is Icelandic for fly lake or midge lake. I visited in 2000, and this is what the shoreline looked like. This is Tanni gracillentis, this gray cloud. It was a particularly high year of abundance when, again, back of the envelope calculations, the biomass of midges coming out of the lake was the equivalent of about 200 humpback whales. That gives you a sense of the scale of these emergences. This is a photograph from the lake itself. What you see across the surface is the exuvia, the shells of midges as they've emerged from the lake, and also dead midges as the females come back to lay their eggs on the lake again. So even though you see them as adults on the lake shore, they really spend their entire, well, almost their entire lives in the lake itself. Just to give you an idea about what the impact is from space, this is an infrared image where brighter red is more chlorophyll, essentially. So it's a way of identifying where there is a lot of plant life growing around Mývatn. Just to point out a few things, that's a field where they apply a lot of fertilizer. And if you look around the lake itself, there's also a lot of red, for example, on an island. And that has the natural fertilizer of midges all over it. So if you think about a midge as a pack of protein that has a lot of nitrogen in it in particular, that's landing and creating meatgrass or midge grass, which actually is really great for sheep farming. Midges have been in the lake since it formed 2,300 years ago or so. This is an old print showing the midges in the right corner. It also shows the duck life of Mývatn, and Mývatn is one of the major breeding sites of ducks in Europe. And this is because of the midges, really, and the high productivity of the lake. It's also, the midges are good on a much smaller scale for things like butterwort. Butterwort is a carnivorous plant. They have sticky leaves. Midges get caught in the stickiness. They then decompose, and the butterwort absorbs all of those nutrients that are contained within the midges. So going back to the dominant species of midge, Tannitarsus, like I said, at high abundance, they are the biomass equivalent of 200 humpback whales. What's, as an ecologist, more interesting to me even, is the variation in abundance. So in a low midge year, the biomass equivalent is about 10 golden retrievers. So the fluctuations in numbers, biomass, is about 5 orders of magnitude, which is huge. It's particularly huge when you think that these midges really dictate everything about the lake. They're the food for all of the ducks, but they also govern things like the nutrient cycling in the lake. In a high midge year, you can take a core. This is just an acrylic tube that you take of the lake. It's showing all of these tubes. These tubes are actually woven by the midges. They produce a silk, and that's where they live. So they're over the entire bottom of the lake. They stabilize the sediment. They oxygenate the sediment. They basically change everything about the sediment. In a low midge year, the sediment looks like that. The first year I started working, 2011, we spent the entire summer and found 1 midge. The entire bottom looked like this. You can see that it's black. There's very little oxygen. It's a completely different lake when there are no midges in it. So what we know about Mývatn really comes from the summer months, mid-May through August. And we know really not that much about what goes on in winter, which was really the opportunity that Fulbright gave me. To come here, I arrived beginning of March, and I could actually see the transition from winter into spring. I thought I'd just talk about 3 lessons that I've had so far in the 2 months that I've been here that really surprised me. The first one is that the lake is actually slow to wake up. The second is related, but the algae don't come out of winter all ready to grow. And then the final one is that spring is a good time to find things. So for the first, this is a photograph that I took in summer. It's again an infrared photograph. So red is chlorophyll. It's where photosynthesis is happening. We've taken a lot of measurements in the summers. We can measure the amount of dissolved oxygen that's produced. That's a measure of primary production. The sediment is very productive. I did exactly the same thing through the ice. Now, through the ice, when there's no snow cover like this year, there's a lot of oxygen in the water. And so I thought, well, gosh, there has to be a lot of primary production. But actually, when you do these incubations in tubes, turns out not so much. The reason why there's so much oxygen in the water is simply because there's ice on the surface, so there's nowhere for it to go. So this was actually a surprise because we thought that the oxygen concentrations meant that there was a lot of production. And to some extent, there's no reason why there shouldn't be production because there is a lot of light penetration through the ice. Clear ice like this is no more or no less transparent than water itself. It's probably simply that it's pretty cold. I also did a set of experiments that were done in a fridge. I could go out, take samples from under the ice, put them in small containers, and put them in a fridge. We use fish tank lights because the algae really likes the color. Then we can do things like take oxygen measurements. So this is an experiment that just finished. It's a little bit complicated, so let me just walk you through it. Indulge me a little bit. So across the bottom this time, so it ran for about a month. One fridge that I did this in was cold, so the average was about 5 degrees, and then I did it at warm, which was about 12 degrees, which is roughly the temperature that you'd get in summer. The vertical axis is the net ecosystem production. So that's basically primary production minus respiration, how much stuff is growing. The different lines have to do with different treatments. The black line is the control. The light blue line and the green lines are additions of nitrate, which is a form of nitrogen. And then the red line and the dark blue line are nitrogen in the form of ammonium. The two lines differ in each case by the concentration. The 0.1 in the key is for a moderate concentration that you find in the sediment itself. And then the other two lines are 3 times that concentration. There's 3 things that I learned from this experiment. One of them you won't see unless you knew what would happen when I did this experiment last summer, which is at the very beginning, things were growing really quickly. Here, it took, well, under cold conditions, it took 2 weeks really for the algae to start growing like they would ordinarily in midsummer. So there was this delay. And this delay was just took time for the algae to grow and get established. A second thing is that if you add nitrate, at least, you get more growth. So in both the cold and the warm situations, the high lines are with added nitrate. This is actually a surprise. I mean, you might think, well, gosh, add nutrients. We know that actually nitrogen is typically limiting, so you get more growth. The thing is that in the summer, when you do this, the algae don't seem to need the nitrogen. There's enough natural sources of nitrogen. I always thought in winter, you know, the algae is just sitting in the bottom, it's dark, they're absorbing nutrients. So as soon as it's light, they're ready to go and they don't need any more nutrients. But I was completely wrong. Then the third thing is you'll notice that ammonium, the red line and the darker blue line, that seems to be toxic. The growth of the algae is less than under control conditions. This is very strange. Most plants love ammonium, actually better than nitrate. But diatoms, which are the algae here, they're the main algae in the benthos, they really don't like nitrate, ammonium. And they're actually waiting. They have to wait for bacteria to convert the ammonium into nitrate before they can grow happily again. So this was a really kind of stunning demonstration that these algae really do depend upon these nitrifying bacteria. The final lesson was that spring is a good time to find things. Right after the ice comes off, the lake is very clear. I was going to one of our regular sample sites and saw this very strange plant out of the corner of my eyes and realized pretty quickly that it wasn't a plant at all. Those are buoys on the left. I pulled everything up and it was an oxygen sensor. It was an oxygen sensor that we actually put down in August 2019. We came back, or we didn't come back the following summer because it was COVID, and we thought that this was lost. Not only did I find it, but it turned out that the oxygen sensor had been running for almost 6 years. It was kind of amusing. I actually sent this to the manufacturers that had recommended deployment use of a maximum of 1 year. And they were really surprised that their instrument could actually do this. I haven't fully analyzed all of the data. The thing that really struck me about it, well, yes, you can see winter, that's when oxygen levels go down. We know that, that's what should happen. This site is actually fairly close to open water areas, so it doesn't go down to 0. But what was really surprising is the lack of oxygen in summer, which seemed to correspond to times when there was blooms of algae in the water column. I'm just watching the time. one of the things also that was a surprise is that the ice came off the lake about a month earlier than it normally does. So this meant that there were a whole bunch of projects that I had lined up that I ended up not doing. It meant that I pulled out a boat earlier than I was planning and got to experience the fun of winter with a boat when you have to worry about things like ice buildup, which you don't have to worry about in summer. I managed to sink the boat. I was not in the boat at the time, but I left it on shore. And there was an unexpected windstorm overnight that undercut the beach. After a fair amount of bailing and some amount of cursing, I did manage to get the boat out of the water. I did want to mention broader impacts because this was something that I really wanted to do. Turns out in winter, people are more relaxed. It was a chance to really, interact more with people in the community. This is Gylfi. If you have ever bought smoked trout or salmon from Mývatn, he was the one who produced it. I invited myself out fishing with him. When I told him about discovering this oxygen sensor later, he was very, very excited because, of course, as a fisherman, he wants to know where in the lake there's oxygen in winter because that's where there are fish. There is a new visitor center for the Mývatn and Vatnajökull National Parks. They opened an exhibit last week. Since I was around, we actually have lab space now at the new visitor center. I could participate in adding some temporary exhibit material. So this is what we call a midge farm, kind of like an ant farm, where all of those tubes were produced by midges that I put in about 3 weeks before this. And we also donated a microscope and I made some slides for people at the exhibit. It's also kind of nice if I'm wandering through, the rangers sometimes pull me over just to kind of give a little bit more discourse on midges for groups of tourists. I also participated in some of those things which you just do. Good Friday walk around Mývatn. It's one of those traditions which I participated in. It's about 30 kilometers, so I did feel it that evening. But I went with Yowie and his sister. Yowie is the local postman. It was his 19th time, so I relied upon him for the pacing, which was very helpful. And finally, I got to enjoy Mývatn in winter. It turns out that it was a lovely opportunity to go and sample on the lake. In summer, we are generally limited by wind because we can't go onto the lake if it's very windy at all. In winter, I had a few really glorious days of sampling. So with that, I'd just like to close and thank Belinda and Peter and Fulbright and NSF. Turns out when I talk to colleagues, oh yes, I have a Fulbright, they say, oh, so you know Belinda. I mean, she has quite a favorable reputation throughout the country. And I understand why. And Peter, I have, I think, never dealt with an administrator who is as effective and polite as you are. So thank you.
Caine, that was absolutely fascinating. Do we have questions? I have there, Liza. Yeah.
Hi. Great presentation. I just had a quick question because as a glacial geologist and geomorphologist, some of the work that I've participated in the past has involved coring lakes and then looking at the layers to understand like climate change in the past. And one of the methods that people use are like chironomid head capsules that kind of like the abundance of them or the type of them can indicate, you know, temperature or climate changes in the past. And I was wondering if any of that sort of stuff has interested you or if that any of that has been done in Mývatn because of this abundance of midges. And yeah, I just wanted to ask about that.
Yeah, so Outney has taken some long cores. I took a core, I don't know, 6 weeks ago. That was one of the things that I wanted to do more of, but I didn't. When Outney's taken some long cores, yeah, the really interesting thing is you can actually see these population cycles for the midges and their food, the algae that they're feeding on. You can actually see that in the cores. In terms of measuring climate change, there's so much biology going on. I probably wouldn't use that for climate change here. That's a much more complicated story. There's 35 different species of midges, but so much of the midge community is dependent upon what types of other types of habitat there are in the lake. I'm analyzing Outney's data again. They now have almost 50 years of direct catches of midges. And just knowing the story of live caught midges, yeah, makes me suspicious of any attempt to try and infer climate change or major patterns like that. I had actually meant to say, Liza, that when you gave your presentation on Monday, I was actually kind of chuckling because my father was doing essentially the same thing in the 1950s, but doing it in a much, much more primitive way. They're actually measuring the advance rate of morsarjökull. And for example, I have a letter that he wrote to my mother, and he was so excited because there'd been some heavy rain and they'd actually recorded an increase in speed of the glacial movement. And that was at a time when they really had very, very little understanding about how glaciers were moving at all. So yeah, I was really, really impressed to see your talk.
Yeah.
That's awesome. Thank you.
I was just wondering if this is a high or a low mid-year.
It's going to be high. Probably the highest will be next year. Second generation, summer generation this year should be pretty high.
Can you just, the Kuluskeeter, that very sort of distinct product of Lake Mývatn, which from what I understand is only found in one other lake in Japan. I mean, the direct translation would be ball dung or something, I don't know. But I mean, from what I've heard, and I don't know if this is related to your field at all, but that it's been going down a lot and is almost disappearing. Does that have anything to do with the midges, or I mean, what is this exactly, and how does it relate to this lake?
Okay, so Kuluskeeter, more officially, probably it's Miramo, named after the lake in Hokkaido where they occur. They do occur in some lakes in Eastern Europe as well. You can actually buy them online for fish tanks and things. But Mývatn and this lake in Hokkaido were the only places where you got these really large ones. Yeah, so the story, we don't really know what's going on. You can still pick up Kuluskeeter, but small ones, kind of babies. What Outney thinks is that, and he was the one that actually discovered them in Mývatn in the 80s. What he thinks is that there haven't been many years where the lake has been completely clear for the entire summer. And these lake balls, Kuluskeeter, really require, these summers of very, very bright conditions, and those just haven't been occurring. To actually test this, I have bought all of the things to make a little swing set for Kuluskeeter. So it's literally a swing set. But for some of the swings, sorry, they're going to be acrylic tubes. But for some of them I can fix, and then for some of them I can let swing. It's thought that water movement is really essential for making them, so we can test that. And then also I have different layers of photographic film, so we can produce different layers of shading to mimic these years of shading, we can set it up in a part of the lake which is typically clear and actually test some of these hypotheses for why they seem to be disappearing in the lake. So that's a plan. And yes, we are all very, very interested in Kuliskita.
Now we're going to move briefly out of Arctic research to another area that this commission has been emphasizing in the past years, cybersecurity. Professor Kelly Caine from Clemson University, Division of Human-Centered Computing, has been teaching and doing research here at the University of Iceland this academic year. She's also given our commission some great tips on our own cybersecurity, which we really needed, I can tell you. And she brought her family with her, so they have also gotten a Fulbright experience. Kelly, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Belinda. I'd just like to say going diet or welcome 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 to everyone here, and also those of you who are joining on Zoom. I'm really, really happy that you could all be here today. Set the timer here.
Oops.
That's okay. Good to get it done now.
Yeah.
Okay, so a little overview of my talk. I'm going to first talk about my Fulbright research that I've done here. Then I'm going to talk a little bit about the teaching that I've done, hopefully with enough time. Mention a couple of the other accomplishments that I'm really proud of during my Fulbright period. Spend a little bit of time on personal reflections, telling you some things about my experience here in Iceland. And then the acknowledgement section, which I could have spent an entire hour on because of the warm welcome and how much help and support I've gotten here in Iceland. So hopefully I'll have time for that at the end. But let's get right into the research portion of it. So for my Fulbright project, I was guided by the Icelandic National Cybersecurity Strategy. In that report, I was in particular drawn to the parts of the report that were about making cybersecurity easier for people. So there was an acknowledgement in the report that without secure workflows that work for humans, we won't have cybersecurity that works for everybody. Still, most of cybersecurity involves humans in it, so we really have to take that into account when we're designing systems and making sure that we combat these issues that might erode trust in the internet, for example. So I looked at what kind of cybersecurity complaints we have. This is around the world, it's not Iceland specific, but we can see that there are nearly 40 billion in losses attributable to cybersecurity issues over this 5-year period. So quite a large problem in cybersecurity. And when we break it down by the kinds of issues that we see, we can see here that phishing, which is a social engineering attack that aims at stealing information from individuals, that accounts for about twice as many of any of these other individual factors. So I really wanted to dig into this piece more about personal information and the revealing of personal information and that tension between when information is public versus private. I'll note that Iceland is not immune to these kinds of cybersecurity attacks. The administrator that's in charge of cybersecurity here notes that there have been attempts within Iceland for cyber criminals to gain access to things like electronic IDs, online banking, or other kinds of identification. So like the rest of the world, Iceland does have these problems. Since being here, I've started collecting examples of the kinds of attacks that I've seen. This one is probably very common to all of you. You probably are aware of this kind of phishing attack. It's probably one of the most common ones. It's where something that purports to come from a trusted source actually comes from a different sender. So from your phishing training that you've probably all done from your organizations, that probably seems pretty common, but still happens. On the other hand, this is a new kind of attack that I had not seen before coming to Iceland. This is a picture at Solheimjökull for the parking where you would pay to park here. And the cyber criminals have created a new QR code, a sticker, and they stuck it over the original. QR code. So when a person would go to pay, they would be directed to a cyber criminal site instead of the real site where they were trying to pay. I see so many faces in the audience. This is really cool that that y'all haven't seen something like this before. Yeah, so there are again examples like this. So what are we supposed to do about this? Well, the advice that comes from experts, this advice is from CISA in the United States. It basically just says, make sure you keep your information private. Don't ever reveal it. There's literally a little tiny spot right here that says, make sure you don't ever give out your credit card number. I was just at the store and I had to give my credit card number in order to make a purchase. So the advice that we give people can be really confusing. When am I supposed to give my credit card number? When am I not? Who am I supposed to give it to? When am I supposed to tell my email address? When am I supposed to keep that secret? And what about my Caine versus my social security number? What am I supposed to do that? So again, the cybersecurity advice within Iceland is really tells people you need to pay closer attention. You need to be vigilant 100% of the time, and you need to make sure you're not revealing information to people that you shouldn't, and that you do give information to people that you're supposed to. So all in all, a bit difficult to follow advice, but this is kind of the best we have right now. So what are you supposed to pay attention to? Well, what you're told is you're not supposed to reveal private or sensitive information. And you are supposed to, as a person involved in using computers, you are supposed to know what is private and you're supposed to know what is public. And I had a question about that because all of the research that's done in the past asks people to rate their perceptions of sensitivity or privacy. But no one had looked at this from the other angle, which is really publicness. And there's an opportunity that I saw specifically here in Iceland, where Icelanders have unique data sharing practices, or at least data sharing practices that are distinct from US populations, where things like the Caine, which is analogous to our social security number that we have in the US, is actually public. It's something you say out loud when you're at a gym. It's something you give out when you make a purchase. So it's not the same, it's not treated in the same way as information we treat like your social security number in the US. And so I saw that as a real opportunity to explore some of these kinds of cybersecurity issues and dig in a little bit in ways that hadn't been done before. So the research question boils down to, what information do people consider public? And is that information the opposite of private or sensitive information? And then how does that differ across an Icelandic or American population for the most part? So the method I used was a survey of Icelandic and US participants. So here's some results. What you can see here on the y-axis is the percent of people who reported that different pieces of information that are along the x-axis are considered public. So you'll notice that there are some differences, and I'll start getting into some of those. One thing overall, though, between both groups that we can see right away that's a problem for cybersecurity researchers in general is that both groups harbor incorrect beliefs. So for example, only 50 to 60% of people in the US and in Iceland reported that they thought their home address was public information. We can see here, this is maybe ancient for the young people in the group, but some of you might recognize this. This is an old thing that we used to have called a phone book, and these are the white pages. And within the white pages, you have a person's name, and you have their address, and you have their phone number. So for a long time throughout history, both in the United States and in Iceland, your address has been public information. It's been something that people have been able to get at least someone who had access to a phone book was able to get that information. Even now in the US, I used the current president of our university's last name to look up property records in Clemson, South Carolina, and so you can find the address of people with that name in Clemson. I also use the National Registry search here in Iceland to look up my name, and you can see that my address is there. So you can look up anybody in Iceland's name in the National Registry, and that's just the practice. And so one thing that this kind of leads to, I think, is for us to look at similarities or differences in the US and Iceland's public perception of the publicness of information. And I should have pointed out here before that the blue is the US public's perception of publicness, and orange is Icelandic participants. So what you'll see here is that overall, Icelandic participants believe, more Icelandic participants, or a higher percentage, believe that more information is public. Whereas people in the US, far fewer of them believe that different pieces of information are public. We might think that perhaps this is just due to a self-disclosure norm, like maybe Americans just don't think that you should disclose as much information, but it turns out that's probably not the case. In a very large study across 57 countries, we found that there's, or the researchers here found that there are really similar self-disclosure norms between people in the US and people in Iceland. When we start looking at individual data pieces, and I'm sorry, my circle here looks like it's a little bit off, but this is a Kynatala or social security number here. We can see that close to 70% of people in Iceland believe that their Kynatala is public information. On the other hand, no US participants believed that their social security number was public information. Those participants, those Icelandic participants who believed that their Kynatala was public indeed were, accurate in their belief. So here again, looking at the National Registry search, you could look up any of us who have a Kynatala and find that Kynatala by our name. On the other hand, the US participants did not report, none of them reported that their social security number was public. So if we interrogate that a little bit, that belief, we can start to poke some holes in it. Acquisti and Gross in 2009 demonstrated that for Americans, you can predict your social security number using your place and date of birth for a large number of people in the US. Then when we start looking at things like data breaches, for example, this data breach that happened just when I was moving from the US to Iceland, that exposed data from 170 million people in the US, UK, and Canada, including their full names, social security numbers, email addresses, mailing addresses, and phone numbers. A lot of data, which there's about 350 million Americans. So maybe even, depending how many of that 170 million people was from the UK or Canada, so let's say a third of American social security numbers were revealed in that data breach. And that's just one of many. In the Equifax data breach, we had 146 million social security numbers revealed. And in 2023 alone, there were 3,000, over 3,000 data breaches. So it's actually likely that despite our belief that our social security number is, Americans' belief that social security number is not public information, it's actually likely that that kind of information is publicly available for many of us. But the advice we're getting from Social Security Administration is to never say our social security number aloud in public. If you're walking around Iceland, you'll hear people say their Kynatala. When I was at a party for a school, you give your Kynatala to pay for some cotton candy or a pancake. It's very common. So I think this advice that we're giving people actually is potentially harmful. We're telling people spend a lot of your time and effort on protecting information that really is already out there in the public, but we are having people that harbor this belief that it's not. So some general findings from this to kind of sum it up. I think that Icelanders have a more realistic understanding of the publicness of information. And I think that that's makes them more robust to certain kinds of cybersecurity attacks. For example, any social engineering attack that's aimed at stealing personal information is not going to be effective when information is already public. So it will change the way organizations behave in the way that they protect information. They'll adjust their expectations of availability
they won't treat information as private when it's actually publicly available. So nobody in Iceland is going to say, oh, do you know your Kennetala? And that's how they verify that you are the person that you say they are, because it's simply not private information. And cyber criminals won't have motivation to steal that information if it's not private. If it's already public, there's no motivation to engage in those kind of social engineering attacks. It also reduces the amount of time that we spend on security theater, the amount of time that we're supposed to remain 100% vigilant about not revealing private information if indeed it's already public. So a lot less wasted time, effort, and energy can be put into, on an individual level, the kinds of cybersecurity protections that we really need to spend time on. We can have more time for those kinds of things rather than wasting our time protecting information that's not public. So this really led me to think about the Icelandic saying of Recedes, which is everything will work out in the end. Again, I think Icelanders have a more realistic perspective here, and that more realistic perspective is protected against certain kinds of cybercrime. So comparing the Iceland and the US really reveals a lot of important design implications here that I wouldn't have been able to come to without doing the research here in Iceland. And I think actually I have a lot more research that I wish I could get into. I just didn't have time to get into it today, but I think it really reveals a lot about the critical infrastructure, the way that it's currently designed, and not only the things it can support, but the things that it can show us that are not supportable about critical infrastructure. Like, we don't have the critical infrastructure currently in place to support the existing beliefs around personal and private and public information. Okay, so what's next in terms of my research? Now that I have all of this research momentum going with all these really interesting findings that have huge implications for cybersecurity, we want to collect additional data in the US to make sure that what we saw replicates, replicates in the US. And I want to work with the colleagues at the University of Iceland, some of whom are here in the room today, to dig deeper into the Icelandic data, do more comparisons, and look at the other data that I didn't get a chance to include today that have really fascinating theoretical implications. And then also publish these results in journals. So now I want to turn to teaching. In addition to the research that I did during my time here, I also had really fantastic students. I taught a class on usable privacy and security in the fall at the University of Iceland. And I wanted to highlight the work of one group, who, the assignment that I gave the student groups was to do research on a particular group of users and things we could do to improve the cybersecurity of that particular group. And so this group, we named all of our groups after places in Iceland. This is the Useable group. This group chose people with dyslexia. So they were trying to make cybersecurity easier for people who have dyslexia. And this is one of the slides that they used in their presentation to show an example of how you might experience reading if you have dyslexia. So if you can imagine trying to read a privacy policy or not fall for a phishing email that comes to you from, the wrong email address, when this is your experience, you can imagine how much more difficult cybersecurity tasks might become. So what they did was they went through the entire design process, all the way from the beginning of understanding their users and then creating paper prototypes to come up with ways to make tasks easier for those users. These are the tasks that people had to do as they were going through their usability test. And then this was their final prototype, were glasses that could perform some correction. You can see on this previous screen that the glasses would do things like highlighting the first letter of words to help people with dyslexia be able to read those words easier. So I was really impressed with this group's creativity and approach to choosing that group, the group of dyslexic participants, to be able to solve cybersecurity issues for that group. So other accomplishments during my time here in Iceland, with my colleagues, that are many of whom are here in the room, I was invited to participate in this Vísindaviku, which is kind of like a science fair for kids. So they spent a lot of time setting up booths and educational activities for kids and also adults to participate in, and they invited me to come be part of that. It was really, really neat to get to be included in that and get to talk to local Icelandic folks about their cybersecurity practices. Also, Tom, who's in the room here, invited me to participate in 2 workshops. One was on socio-technical resilience and cybersecurity that was here in Iceland in October, and then another one that was in Milton Keynes in the UK in March. And both of those were incredibly good experiences to, again, further discuss the social aspects of cybersecurity. I also was really interested when I first got here on this comparison between Iceland and the US and also European countries in terms of cybersecurity knowledge, perceptions of privacy. But it turns out that there's not a lot of existing data that was already out there where you could do those kinds of comparisons. So one thing I did was submit a proposal to the General Social Survey in the United States to align the privacy and cybersecurity questions with questions that are in the European cybersecurity, or the European Social Survey with the American Social Survey. And so that's something that could benefit future scholars who are interested in comparing the US and Iceland and other European countries in the future. I also got to give a talk at UT Messen, which is the largest IT conference in Iceland. That was a fantastic experience. I got to speak in Eldborg, which is the beautiful concert hall in Harpa, and it was truly a highlight of my life. It's the same stage that Yo-Yo Ma played on. It was like a childhood hero of mine, so I was very excited, and I got a few smiles and laughs during the talk, so it was just a really wonderful experience. Okay, personal reflections. So many firsts. It was my first time seeing the Northern Lights. They're spectacular. It was my first time visiting Vithi and seeing the Northern Lights with the Peace Tower going. It was spectacularly beautiful. It was my first time seeing the Northern Lights with fireworks on New Year's. I didn't think that could happen. I also saw a shooting star with the Northern Lights. It was amazing. And then also just like walking out from the pool over the houses in Vesabyre, that's just what it was like walking out on a random evening. It was gorgeous. And then this is called Glitski. I didn't know what it was when I first saw it. Some friends were here visiting, and we were driving into the airport, and I saw this spectacular iridescent pearl in the sky, and I had no idea what it was, but it was amazingly beautiful. And it's called Glitski, and it's only happens very rarely. It's much more rare than Northern Lights, and it only happens in very, very, very cold conditions where ice crystals form like this, and just looked unreal, otherworldly. I got to visit Lauterberg and see Puffin's Nest. Driving there was wild. We hosted 15 visitors from the United States, not dwarfed by Carrie's 50. But for us, that was a lot. We got to see a lot of really neat places with those folks. On a very personal level for me, I'm an equestrian. I was a horse girl as a little kid. One of the benefits for me of Iceland was that I knew I would get to be around horses. And so I got to go on really beautiful trail rides. I think this one is on my birthday. And snuggle with adorable Icelandic horses. I really just loved riding. It was great. Okay, acknowledgements. I think I'm just about time. First, I want to thank my mom who instilled in me a sense of adventure. I don't think I'd be here if she hadn't been the kind of mom that said, you can do whatever you want and you should go out on adventures. To the rest of my family who put up with only talking to me by video chat for an entire year. Dad, Matt, my nieces, I really appreciate you. My friend Jen, who has a baby about as old as mine. I really appreciate everybody for supporting that. The University of Iceland has been incredibly supportive during my entire time here. Matthias Book, who's the chair, was the chair of the computer science department during my time here. He answered every question that I had and was just incredibly helpful. Hjalmar provided a letter of invitation for my Fulbright. My other colleagues in the CS department, especially Eva, Christian, Essa, Tom, and Helmut, who were my lunch buddies, and again, just really made my time and experience here wonderful. Clemson for supporting my sabbatical, the National Science Foundation for supporting my research over decades at this point. The Hat Lab, my lab back in Clemson, for keeping everything running, especially Bart and Emily, and my students for being willing to work remotely with me for a year. Belinda and Pieter, who answered just over the top. I could talk for 5 minutes, so 10 minutes, 20 minutes about how many things they did to help me and the rest of the Fulbright group. But just one example of this is Belinda welcoming my son and Mia welcoming us for trick-or-treating on Halloween. It's the kind of thing that's just over and above anything that you have to do, and that's been my experience with the Fulbright Commission here. Fellow Fulbrighters, I just want to say that I feel honored to be in a group with you. You are so smart, purpose-driven, impressive, and I feel lucky to be part of the group with you. Eisborg, the school where my son went to school, that led to Lake Scully here. I think they have the best playground probably, and maybe in the world. They took care of him so well. I think it's going to be difficult to take him back to the U.S. because how good the school was here. The staff are amazing. Again, Dr. Matthias Book and Christy, his wife, I call them my fairy godmother in Iceland. Anytime I needed anything, so I would text Christy and be like, "Where can I buy this thing?" And she'd be like, "Oh, I'll just bring it to you." And that happened 30, 40 times. They took us. This is a picture of us at Eider, where they do the sheep herding in the fall. I've got a real Icelandic experience through the friendship and things that events that they took us on. My yoga teachers, especially Johanna and Anne Marie, I leveled up my yoga while I was here in Iceland. Elsa Eriksdotter, who is a Fulbright alum, she and I met while we were in graduate school 20 years ago at Georgia Tech. And when I thought about doing a Fulbright I emailed her first and she said, "Yeah, come on." And she put me in touch with Hjalmar, who wrote the letter. And then since being here, she's again helped me really get integrated with Icelandic culture. She had us over for pancakes and coffee and birthday parties. And I really feel like I've gotten a lot of help from her and Icelandic experience. Finally, to Micah and Bash for coming on this adventure with me. If Micah hadn't been down when I mentioned, "Hey, what do you think about going to Iceland?" And if he hadn't said, "Yeah, let's do it," there's no way we would have been able to come. So I'm really, really grateful to Micah for being down and for Bash for just being an absolute joy in my life every day. Micah said, "This has been an incredible experience for our family. We're so grateful." And Bash said, "Jeg elsker Ísland og ís," which is ice cream. With that, I just finished with this picture of me at the bridge between continents, so that where the Eurasian and North American plates meet. I hope that I can be a bridge in the future between the U.S. and Iceland. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Kelly. It's just wonderful. Cybersecurity, yes.
Yeah, I had heard that Iceland has maybe become more vulnerable now that AI is able to speak Icelandic. That was a way of people kind of weeding out fishers in the past, and now they're even receiving phone calls where AI can speak Icelandic to people who are not used to that. Maybe is that a large scale threat to Icelandic cybersecurity?
It's a threat around the world.
Okay.
I don't think so I think actually the findings that I have around publicness of information make aren't affected as much by AI. Because if information is public and it's perceived as being public, then there just aren't the motivations for people to engage in those kind of phishing attacks. Something like a credit card number, there's no problem. If somebody calls you and you give them your credit card number, it's actually not an issue. We just reissue a new one. It's a problem when we reveal information that actually legitimately should be private. So something like in the US, the way that we treat currently social security numbers, because it can't be reissued. Biometrics can't be reissued, but something like a credit card can. So at any rate, there is, within the cybersecurity community, there's a huge amount of effort being devoted to understanding the risks that are posed by AI and coming up with additional preventions. I think this can play in because it makes the entire community more robust to AI attacks, but also other attacks that don't involve AI. But yeah, Icelandic cybersecurity folks are fully aware of the ChatGPT and AI issue. Yeah, great question.
Yeah, let's start with Jared.
So I'm struck by the comparison between the Kenatella and the social security number. And I wondered if you had any thoughts on how the US gets away from the model that it currently has, where the social security number is simultaneously privileged information and incredibly public, to, is there something it can learn from the Icelandic model in terms of how to reform the US approach?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's at the core of this research. I think indeed making the case to organizations in the US that are in a position to use the social security number as if it's sensitive or private or privileged, making the case to them, then indeed you can't continue to use that. And we need to move to a different form of authentication. A lot of my other research outside of this project is on authentication and other ways that we can do better authentication. So I think that there are certainly other options, but it's one of those things that won't change quickly. It will be a gradual change over time. And I think having Iceland as a model to show how it can work, and some other Scandinavian countries have similar models, but they have other pieces of information that they keep super private. I think having Iceland and other Scandinavian countries as a model can indeed facilitate that change that frankly needs to happen in the US. Yeah, great question.
Sarah?
Actually, two questions.
Yeah, great.
I was wondering first with the differences there, like what struck me is that like the US is such an individualistic culture, and this is much more like community socialist, culture. And I was wondering how much do you think that plays into like people's perception that things are private or should be private versus like the actuality of that?
It's a great question. So I haven't looked into that yet, but the data that I cited, the study that compares 57 countries in terms of self-disclosure norms, they did actually look into the dimension of individuality versus communality. And so I'm not sure if I can directly use that data to answer your question, but there are data out there about that, and I would love to look at that more. Yeah, it's a great question.
My other question was just like from an, individual perspective of those of us in the room, like what, since those pieces of information are not actually as, protected as we like to think they are, what do you think is protected, and what steps do you think that we should take to protect them? So I'm thinking of like freezing your credit, for example, like is that?
Yeah.
But then there are other things.
That's not for Icelandic situation, but for folks that are in the US, indeed, that's really the only solution right now is to freeze your credit. And what happens when you freeze your credit is you get a code that's generated that's unique to you, and you have to keep that code. And it's not anything that's based on your birthday. It's not anything that's based on your address. It's a unique code. They used to do it poorly, but now they're doing it better. And you have to keep that safe and secure. And indeed, that's something that there's no need for anybody to ever know it. The ones that are different are like your birthday. There's a big need for people to know your birthday. You want people to be able to celebrate. You can find out people's birthdays by looking at things like pictures. The solution is things like creating specific codes that should be kept secret between one person and an organization, and that there aren't motivations to share it otherwise. And freezing your credit is a very practical thing that I personally have. also done.
How do you keep that number? Because I'm just going like,
Okay, we'll talk, later we'll talk, I'll give you all my practical cybersecurity
Yes,
tips later, yeah.
exactly, yeah. She went over this with us. So thank you so much, Kelly. Certificate of completion and a little memento and your Fulbright Iceland pin. Thank you.
So now I'm really excited to introduce our first recipient of the Distinguished Award in Teaching Research. It's an award that has existed on the U.S. side for many years, but this is the first time that Iceland is participating. And so Sabrina Miller, who's a teacher from Eastside Community High School in New York, is hosted by the School of Education. That was, we were very happy to have as a partner. They were up for it to do this with us. So we were really happy about that, because I think that we really believe here at Fulbright Iceland, those of us who work here, the board, that providing opportunities for teachers is a really impactful way to utilize Fulbright, right? And especially Fulbright's goal to increase mutual understanding. So let's welcome Sabrina.
Thank you, Belinda. And thank you all for being here, both in person and online. I'm already seeing all the comments in the chat, so thank you all for being here. So I'm here in Iceland, focusing on sustainability education in particular, and how sustainability education can be used to empower students to take action and to try to make change in their local communities. So to start, I wanted to say that education has been shown to make a difference. This is from a 2020 study that was done at San Jose State University that shows that climate education can potentially be as effective as other established climate change mitigation strategies. Implementation of climate change education over a 30-year period, you can see in this graphic here, which is from the study, could reduce CO2 emissions by almost 19 gigatons of carbon dioxide, which would rank in one of the top in the top quarter of solutions, according to Project Drawdown, which is this project established by scientists to try to bring carbon emissions down below net zero. So as inspiration for my project, this was one of the sources of inspiration as well. Sorry, some of my formatting got a little messy here, but this is from a 2020 study of New York City DOE sustainability coordinators. And I want to acknowledge these people in particular. One of my my co-teacher at my school is a sustainability coordinator for our school, and this is a volunteer position entirely. It's a ton of work, but they don't get paid extra. They do it because they're passionate about it, because they care about the environment, because they care about sustainability. And these sustainability coordinators themselves were asked, do you teach about climate change? And you can actually see here a surprising number either don't teach climate change, or maybe only mention it in their classes, or just teach one or two lessons on climate change. So then when we asked, why don't you teach about climate change? They said, it's not related to the subjects that they teach, or they don't have the materials they need, they don't know enough about it. And so that was really the inspiration here, that US teachers were expressing uncertainty about how to approach climate change in their own classrooms. And then also from my own experiences teaching, I was noticing that students were feeling disempowered to make real change, especially when you're hearing the news constantly. There's a lot of negativity out there, and particularly when it comes to things like climate and the environment right now, that how do we hang on to hope and try to make change? So my research aims, I'll just read this first part here. My goal is to find ways to encourage students to be agents of positive change who engage in pro-environmental and sustainable behaviors. As a result of this research, I will develop curricula and teacher professional development workshops that I will share with teachers in Iceland and back home in New York City. I have 3 research questions that I was focused on during my time here. The first one is, how are climate change and sustainability curricula implemented in Icelandic schools? So to answer that question, I began by visiting schools. I visited 8 schools so far in or near Reykjavik and 4 schools in Akureyri. These were mostly grades 8, 9, and 10, but I also did observe 1 5th grade class and 1 7th grade class as well. One thing I wanted to highlight are some cultural differences here. There are many similarities, as we talked about earlier, between teenagers and children in the US and in Iceland, but there are some notable differences as well. One thing is everybody, when you first enter the school building, you can see in this photo here, everyone takes off their shoes. And so a lot of students are just walking around school in their socks, or they might wear like slippers or slides. And teachers as well are wearing indoor shoes, which was a big shock when I got there. They were like, okay, take your shoes off. And I was like, I don't have anything else to wear. They're like, that's fine, just walk around in your socks, that's okay. Second was staff lounges resemble cafes, kind of like, sort of fancy coffee houses. And they're places where teachers can relax in between classes. So this is a clear indicator to me that teacher well-being is really valued. A lot of schools in the US don't even have teacher lounges, so this was really amazing to see. And these were also places where teachers got to meet with each other and collaborate with each other, both formally and informally throughout the day. Another major surprise to me was the amount of different classes that students take that aren't just solely focused on academics. They also are taking some sort of more practical hands-on classes. Like they all learned handicrafts like knitting and sewing. So all kids can, you can see actually in the background here, there's some handicrafts hanging in the window. I think I probably didn't even know how to sew a button on a shirt until I was like 20. So yeah, it's a little bit different. I am also learning how to crochet while I'm here, so I've been getting involved in it as well. Students also take woodworking, cooking, and swim classes as well. So again, it's practical knowledge is emphasized as well. And all students learn simultaneously from a young age Icelandic, English, and Danish. So I'm going to now kind of focus it on just what I'm seeing in the natural science classrooms, just since that is my subject area and what I'm focusing my research on. So this was a typical class structure that I saw, mostly, again, focusing on 8th, 9th, and 10th grade. There was an opening, usually where the teacher was talking and introducing some new topic, and students were listening. That was usually followed by some passive student participation, usually watching videos or following along while a text was being read aloud. And again, during that time, students were usually just listening. Sometimes we're taking notes, but often we're just kind of sitting and listening. And then there was some active, and this, by the way, would usually be like the first half of class. If the class varied between like 45 to 50 minutes, this was often the first half of it. And then there was a active student participation component, and I bolded this because this is the part that I was really interested in. And most often what I saw here was that students were answering questions in a workbook, or they were doing some research online to write a report about a topic. In all of the schools that I visited, and some of these schools I only, like the schools in Akureyri, for example, I only got to visit one time, but many of the schools in Reykjavik I visited multiple times. Only twice during these observations did I see students actually collecting their own data to evaluate. So there are some opportunities here, which I will talk more about in a moment. And then finally, there was some class wrap-up where there was usually a teacher-led summarization of the group work, and there was an emphasis on correct answers. Usually the teacher would go over the correct answer and write the correct answer on the board for students to copy. In 3 of the schools, so the 2 schools in Reykjavik and the 1 in Akureyri, I observed final projects on sustainability or renewable energy. So the projects in all 3 of these schools involved either independent or in a group, some online research that culminated in a class presentation, which you can see this picture in the middle here. This was from a school in Akureyri. There was a student presenting about sustainable energy, and I was really excited actually about this presentation because this was the first example I had seen of a student representing data. They had just found the data online. It was a breakdown of different types of energy, but this was the first time I had seen a student actually like collecting and analyzing some data here and representing it in a pie chart. So for me, that was like, I put down in my notebook, I remember like 3 exclamation points, like data, yay. I was very excited. So the 2 schools in Reykjavik also required students to create some product. So a board game or a poster, an Instagram page, you can see that on the left here, this was an Instagram page a student made. The one on the right over here was like a booklet that they made that was about sustainability, and they could focus on different topics. Some students focused on global issues like palm oil plantations in Borneo, others focused on local issues like upcycling textiles in Iceland. One thing I was really impressed by was many students reported learning about the UN Sustainable Development Goals from a young age, like as young as like 2nd or 3rd grade. They already knew what they were. And the students made connections to the SDGs on their own independently in their project. So this was this picture here is of a student presentation, and I had asked them when they were, I got to see their presentation, I got to see them beforehand, like actually working on it. And I remember them making the slide, and I asked them, like, why are you including this? Like, where did you learn about it? And they were like, well, we've known about this forever. And we're including it because it's relevant, it makes sense. And I wanted to know, like, well, was this in the rubric? Did the teacher tell you to add this? And they were like, no, it made sense, so we included it. So it was amazing to me that they were making independently these connections. So I mentioned there are some opportunities here. There is a new curriculum that was just revised as of this past fall, and the changes are supposed to be implemented this upcoming school year, the 2025-26 school year. And there were assessment criteria that were developed for grades 4, 7, and 10. Grades 4 and 7 are really just benchmarks, but grade 10 are the criteria that are going to be used to evaluate them for graduation. And then also determine their placements at their framhaldsskole, which is like a junior college before they go to university. So there are 6 criteria here. Some of my formatting got very strange converting it to PowerPoint, but we'll roll with it. I don't know what happened there, but yeah, don't use Google Slides, I guess. That's lesson learned. I'm going to focus on, even though it tells us to view them as a continuous whole, I'm going to break that, and I'm just going to focus on the environment here. Here we go. This looks okay. So I wanted to emphasize a couple of things that I was seeing in the curriculum that I thought were really noteworthy and quite different from the the science education standards in the US. So one, there's this emphasis on ethical aspects, in addition to learning about the science, but connected to nature conservation, there's an emphasis on ethics. So one quick story, like in New York, many of you might be familiar with is there are lanternflies. We get these invasive pests that are really terrible for the plants. They basically feed on the sap and can kill crops. We are just told in New York to stomp on them. We are encouraged to do that, to wipe them out. But maybe we should be talking to people about the ethics of that, like, and understanding, like, if we're going to do that, well, especially even young kids, like, why are we harming these bugs but not these other ones? Thinking about, well, why are we doing this? What is the rationale behind that? And I really appreciate that that is something it's in the curriculum standards. For climate change, we're not only focusing on the causes and consequences, but also mitigation strategies. For individuals in the environment, focusing on the relationship between the individual and their immediate local surroundings, but also on a global scale as well. How do you fit in the world? And then finally, this last one was huge, the ability to take action. So to organize and participate in actions related to nature conservation and environmental issues, both locally and globally. This action competency is something that I feel like has come up again and again, and it's not something that I've seen like as explicit in the US curriculum. So my next question was, how are teachers supported to implement the curricula and sustainable practices? this one got really weird. Okay. So the key thing I want to highlight here is actually this thing at the top. So all teachers interviewed agreed that climate change and sustainability should be part of the natural science curriculum. That to Icelanders might seem like not such a big important thing to emphasize, like that's just like, well, duh, of course. But I'm from the US, and so this is really noteworthy to me that everyone just universally was like, yes, of course this should be included. And teachers felt that it should be introduced at a young age. Even in second, third grade, they might start with things like, in here in giant text, nature conservation, and thinking more about like what's happening with plants and animals. And then when they get a bit older, in those middle grades, then talking more about climate inequities and climate injustice. So I asked teachers as well, how do you integrate solutions and hope into your teaching, especially when addressing climate change? And so there were many, many different responses that I got, but these really, I kind of was able to sort them into 4 major categories. First was teachers said that they explore existing solutions and technology with their students. One was actually connected to what Carrie was talking about, the reforestation of Iceland. There is a project, I believe was spearheaded by Landvernd to plant native birch trees. So they're going around and collecting birch seeds and replanting them. So they are getting schools involved in this effort. Second was integrating art into science learning. So there were things that were happening in the science classes, but there was also a lot of interdisciplinary learning, connecting science with the other subjects as well. So one thing I saw was some upcycling of textiles and handicrafts classes, which to me was like the most Icelandic thing I think I'd seen. Third was a focus on humanity. So emphasizing the human stories about the impact of climate change, like learning about climate refugees and hearing about them personally and how they're affected and what choices do they have moving forward. And then finally, almost everybody said, if you want to give students hope, you need to take action. That was number 1. So the most common things I heard from teachers when I asked, like, well, what kinds of actions do you take with your students? Most often I heard things like waste sorting competitions or campaigns to walk or bike to school, but some were also organizing clothing swaps, writing letters, fundraising, and some also do these sustainability theme days where theme days are basically like they take a week off of their normal classes and they do workshops, and many schools focused on climate change or sustainability during those weeks. Some other interviews or some other findings from interviews with teachers, some teachers felt that the new curriculum was too broad and that there was a lack of support in implementing the new curriculum. They really want more help, like more workshops to understand how to incorporate these changes. Second was that instructional choices were largely driven by textbooks. So this book in the background, Maður og Náttúra, is Man and Nature. That I saw a lot in grades 8, 9, and 10, and that book I think is from 2013-ish, yeah. And then this is a newer book, but this is for grades 5, 6, and 7, and it comes with a workbook as well. So I think that's a very popular choice because it's both a workbook and a textbook. Teachers want more professional learning during the school day to discuss the implementation of the new curriculum, to stay abreast of the latest research, both in education and in science, and to minimize scheduling conflicts since they have so many things that they're doing during their school day, both with teaching and grading and parent outreach. And a few teachers also expressed that they need better facilities and equipment, and they need support in ordering materials. So where do teachers go for support? Most often they said university workshops, either at Háskóli Íslands or also in Akureyri, the University of Akureyri as well. Landvernd also came up quite a bit, the Green Flag program and the Environmental Reporter Project. I actually got to see this in action at Garðaskóli in Reykjavik. There were, I think, 3 or 4 schools that were doing first Lego League. And I think 1 or 2 teachers also mentioned science on stage. So then my last question, what impact do these curricula have on students' connection to nature and pro-environmental behaviors? So I've given students an anonymous survey to assess their connection to nature and their sustainability attitudes and beliefs. So the nature connection survey was 17 questions. And you can see, like if I take this first one, for example, I am not separate from nature, but a part of nature. If they said they strongly agree with that, they got a higher score. But other ones were reverse coded. So for example, humans have the right to use natural resources any way we want. If they strongly agreed with that, then they got a lower score. That was the ones in red were reverse coded. For sustainability attitudes and behaviors, it was 14 questions. So similar, my decision to live sustainably, have a real impact on the living and working conditions of others. If they said strongly agree, that would be a higher score. But if they said, I often use single-use disposable products like plastic cutlery, they would get a lower score if they strongly agreed. So here are some of the results. So I'm still, this is just from 4 schools so far. I actually just this morning got results from a 5th school. So I'm still waiting on like 3 or 4 schools to send me their survey results. But so far, you can see the schools here, the students from these 4 schools, it was a 196 student survey thus far, have a slight connection to nature. And there's really no significant difference between the schools, whether they were in Akureyri or in Reykjavik. The ones that are have an A next to it are from Akureyri, these 2 are in Reykjavik. And we found a similar thing as well with sustainable attitudes and behaviors, just sort of slightly above neutral here, slightly sustainable attitude and behavior, and really no significant difference in the survey results across schools. I also did look at the correlation here between these 2 survey scores. I've got an R-square value of 0.332, which indicates some correlation between students' nature connection and their sustainability attitudes and behaviors. I do want to say, like, I only surveyed 8th, 9th, and 10th graders, and there does tend to be a dip in the teenage years when it comes to nature connection, which hopefully does recover into adulthood. So we didn't survey younger students or adults, so that could be in line with other findings that there is just a little bit of a dip there, but not so much of a dip that they don't have any nature connection anymore. It's just like a bit above neutral. But the other thing I'm wondering here based on this result is what else besides nature connection can promote sustainable behaviors and lifestyle changes? Maybe just connection to nature isn't quite enough. Maybe there's some other things that we should be exploring as well. And especially helping people to more quickly recover from that dip. I also interviewed 10th grade students, and I could talk all day about our conversations and what I learned from the students, but I'm going to summarize it in just 2 slides here. So some of the strengths that I saw, students reported learning, as I mentioned before, about the UN SDGs from a very young age and made their own connections to it in their learning. Students understood that there is a scientific consensus about climate change and its impact. All students were able to come up with at least one solution to mitigate climate change. And all students seemed to understand the importance of sorting waste correctly. And they all were like, yeah, of course we all do this. And when I was asking about it, they were like, looking at me like, well, of course we do this. Like, why wouldn't you do that? And I included this, I asked the student, what was your biggest takeaway from learning about climate change? And they said, even small changes can have a big impact. Some opportunities. There were some student misconceptions about what causes climate change. Students often conflated climate change and pollution, for example. One student said climate change is caused by bad chemicals from things we make. And these are 10th grade students, so they're about to graduate from Grunnskole. Another group of students confused greenhouse gases and the ozone layer. That is a very common misconception that I see even in students in the US. And a few students focused on plastic pollution when I asked specifically about climate change. They kept trying to talk about other environmental issues, but even when I was focusing on climate change, they were focusing on plastic. It's like, not the same. Students also reported that they don't think much about climate change outside of school, and they don't think that it impacts them personally. And students reported learning about climate change in school mostly by reading or watching videos or reading about it, and doing online research projects about it. Few students reported actually conducting their own experiments or even analyzing data from other experiments about climate change, which was really surprising to me because there is a wealth of data out there on climate change and its impacts. So I think that there's definitely an opportunity there. So to kind of wrap this up and talk about where I'm going from here, again, my driving question was, how do you inspire students to make positive and lasting changes in their communities that can drive societal transformation? So what I have found so far is that teaching methods should encourage action because it has been shown to reduce climate anxiety and increase student agency. And also that small actions can lead to significant change. And you don't have to wait for large-scale reforms to celebrate progress. Even small things that we can do today need to be celebrated, especially when we're constantly getting inundated with news, and not all of it is good news. So celebrating the small wins is really important as well. Some lessons I'm taking from my Fulbright experience specifically for curriculum development. The value of outdoor education and place-based education, the shift from environmental education to education for sustainable development, and using future thinking to help students envision a sustainable future and consider what steps we can take to achieve this vision. And I forgot to mention at the beginning that all these pictures in the background are photos I've taken while in Iceland. Beautiful, lots of beautiful waterfalls. So first, outdoor education. This was actually from a class that I had audited at the University of Iceland. It was in the international school, so it was in English. So this is a class that was on sustainability and sustainability education. It was taught by Karen Jordan, who was pictured here. And we went on a field trip to a couple of different places throughout Reykjavik. And here we are at Hólavallagarður Cemetery. And on this trip, it was very open. The instructions were just observe your local surroundings, pay attention to the environment and the infrastructure, and consider three things. What was here before, what is here now, and what will be here or could be here. And for me, this was really powerful because I feel like from this one trip to a cemetery, I learned so many things. I learned so much about the history of Reykjavik. Here we are actually standing around the famous Icelandic poet's grave, Páll Ólafsson, and we learned about how at some point his grave was like lost and they were trying to find it, and they had students from the university coming with like sonar to try to relocate his grave. So they successfully did that. And here Jakob here is about to read or is reading one of his poems, which is about the golden plover. It's a bird that is known as the harbinger of spring in Iceland. I also learned that this cemetery is about to get UNESCO World Heritage Foundation recognition, or it's working toward it, because there are 4 species of rare moss that are found there and almost nowhere else in the world. So just this one experience, there were many opportunities to learn about history and literature and science. And I, of course, brought my binoculars as well. I was bird watching in the cemetery. So this one experience, and I think the openness of it, like students have the opportunity to really explore what is most interesting to them. Second is this shift from environmental education to education for sustainable development. So I first actually learned about this by reading this book. I had to translate the whole thing from Icelandic to English, which took a long time, but I did get there. This is a sustainability handbook that was written by Guðrún Schmidt from Landvernd. And essentially, she is saying that traditional environmental education focuses on increasing students' knowledge, awareness, and appreciation of nature and environmental issues, but we should really be shifting more towards education for sustainability, which not only focuses on the environment, I think like Carrie was mentioning earlier as well, but the interactions of the environment also with the social and the economic spheres as well. So ESD really builds upon build upon the foundations of environmental education, but shifts this emphasis a bit to help students take meaningful action. Connected to that as well, is this three-stage approach that I learned about from UN SDG Learn. First is the head. It's kind of what I think of as more traditional schooling, knowledge building, and meaning making, which ideally should be student-centered, inquiry-based learning experiences. Second is the heart. It is also important to expand students' perspectives, and ESD really requires this fundamental shift in values, attitudes, and motivations, and a cultivation of empathy and compassion, which is something that I think is not always emphasized in science class. And third is the hand. So the ability to plan, implement, and evaluate action. So this action competency coming up again. And this last component in particular, evaluating actions, is so important. It's not enough to just plan something, do it, and be like, well, I'm done, I did it. You have to go back and evaluate it. Like, did it work? How effective was it? How could I improve upon this design in the future? And then third was this future thinking activity that also came from this class that I audited. So Karen had us think about a sustainability issue in Reykjavik or in Iceland. This was pretty open, and you could do this really with any city, but you could think of any sustainability issue. So when I did this in her class, I was focusing on the all the food importation that happens in Iceland. But there were many different things that different groups focused on. We had to think about all the possible futures in relation to that issue in 30 years' time, and then think about what is the most probable future. If we don't do anything, if this is just status quo, what's most likely to happen? And then consider what's the preferable future? What do we want to happen in 30 years' time? And then work backwards from then to now. And then consider what steps need to be taken to make your vision a reality. What can you do today to start working toward that preferable future? Okay, so next steps. For my research product, I'm currently working on, just started developing this curriculum, which I'm going to share with stakeholders back in the US, with the Fulbright stakeholders, and also with my teacher education networks back in New York City. I will also be sharing it with the Icelandic education professors and teachers that I've met here. And I'm also offering some professional development workshops. I have one in Iceland scheduled for a couple weeks, and then also back in the US when I get back to New York. And I have a million people to thank and not enough time, but I just want to acknowledge like all of the help that it took to make this research a reality. But a special thank you in particular to all of the teachers who welcomed me into their classroom. I was really amazed at the number of teachers that were like, absolutely, yes, you can come, let's talk. They were very open. And so I had a really great experience with them. So thank you all very much.
Very impressive, thank you. Maybe one question, if somebody has something before we move on. Yeah.
So I'm curious to what degree they talked about sustainable development, environmental issues, climate change in terms of what we in political science call the shadow of the future. So the ways in which how we think about the world today gets extended out into the future. You mentioned the dip in the teenagers who are not well known for thinking about the future. And so I was wondering if there was any incorporation of that in the curriculum that you observed.
Oh, that is a good question. Not that I've seen.
Okay.
That is a good question. I think it's a good thing for future research as well. I mean, that was something that when I mentioned the dip, that wasn't something that I was specifically studying. It was just something that had come up in the literature, but that was really not specific to Iceland. That was, I think, research that I had read back in the US. That was, seemed to apply here as well.
Great. I mean, fabulous. We're off to a great start with this grant, hopefully for the future. So thank you very much. I also, so Yes, so we have for you, even though you do have 1 month left, you've been here long enough that we're confident in giving you a certificate.
Thank you.
Ah. So, final speaker of the day is Jared Hayes from University of Massachusetts Lowell. His field is international relations. He's the first recipient, so a couple of firsts here today. He's the first recipient of the Fulbright-NSF Arctic Security Award, which allows scholars, working in the important field of security in the Arctic region to spend 3 months in Iceland and 3 months in another Nordic country to conduct research. And the first year, the pilot project, it was actually between Iceland and Finland. So he's already spent 3 months in Finland, the first 3 months of this year, and now he's here in Iceland since the beginning of April, hosted by the University of Iceland. Of course, he's only a third way through his time here in Iceland, but he's done with 4 out of 6 months of his total grant. So I'm sure he has plenty to share with us about his project. So please enlighten us.
Okay, so I'm going to start with my acknowledgements first, just to mix things up. So I want to thank Belinda and Petter and the Fulbright Commission here, obviously the Fulbright Commission in Finland, which I just sort of showed up and they're very welcoming to me. Obviously the National Science Foundation and the U.S. State Department for supporting this program. My host here, Sila Yavara, who is the incoming rector at the University of Iceland. So she has had a lot of time demands and she's been very gracious with me, as well as the University of Iceland. My host at the University of Turku, Juha Vuori in Finland. My interview subjects here, I can't name any of them because they're all confidential, but if in the event that they ever see this, thank you very much to you. My home university, University of Massachusetts Lowell, for supporting my sabbatical. And finally, but maybe most importantly, my wife and children. My wife is at home taking care of our 3 daughters, and I would not be here if it were not for her efforts to make sure that they're all alive and happy and healthy, and my kids who have been very gracious in seeing their dad away for 6 months. Okay. So I hopefully get this inaugural program off to a good start. I don't know. The project I proposed is the start of a book-length project trying to make sense of how the Arctic positionality of states, so in my case, Finland and Iceland and perhaps others, how that is influencing their approach to foreign policy, specifically factoring through questions of Arctic security and climate change. Okay, so I have to apologize in advance. I'm a political scientist. I'm not a quantitative political scientist, so I have no interesting charts. And I was not very imaginative with my slides, so I did not put any really cool pictures in. So it's just a bunch of really boring text. Okay, so 3 months in Finland, 3 months in Iceland. The methodology I use is entirely, at this point, interview-based. I'm trying to understand how practitioners and vested members of civil society, so leaders of business associations, as well as more traditional environmental NGOs, are thinking about climate change, are thinking about Arctic security, and how that's getting implemented into their foreign and security policy practices. So these are the kind of the questions that I used to motivate the study. My starting point was thinking about the parallels between the Arctic nations and the small Pacific island nations. So if any of you have followed the debates around climate change in the international arena, the small Pacific island states have really tried to leverage their vulnerability, particularly to sea level rise, in an effort to add greater weight to their voices. So these are small states, they're developing states in the context of international affairs. scholars of international affairs pay almost no attention to them, fairly or not. But we argue in the scholarship that the big states don't pay very much attention to them either, right? The big states are only really concerned about what other big states do, and they don't care that much about small states. And the small Pacific Island states have tried to use climate change to bolster their voices, to add more weight, in not only in discussions specifically on climate change, but also outside of those discussions by vectoring through climate change. So my questions were really about, are we seeing something similar taking place for the Arctic states? And there are good reasons why the Arctic states might want to use climate change and Arctic questions of Arctic security to leverage their voices. So first of all, outside of the United States and Russia, and to a lesser extent Canada, so the other 5 Arctic nations are relatively small. Finland has a population of about 5 million. Obviously, Iceland is not a microstate, but a small state. Sweden is the largest with about 10 million. Norway is at about 5 million. Denmark, I don't know what the population of Denmark is, but the population of Greenland, which is Denmark's entree into this region, is very small as well, something like 50,000 people, something like that. So these are small states by relative standards. So they share that sort of in common with the Pacific states. The states in the region are incredibly vulnerable to climate change. So the Arctic region is changing anywhere from 3 to 4, warming at anywhere from 3 to 4 times as fast as the rest of the globe. You see less of the kind of more obvious physical manifestations that you see in Russia and in the Canadian and U.S. Arctics in the form of permafrost, right? Buildings are lurching to the side in the European Arctic, but in the Norway, Sweden, Finland context, you have the Sami peoples whose way of life is undergoing profound challenge because of climate change effects. Here in Iceland, a lot of those climate change effects that we tend to think about, rising sea level, not actually a problem here in Iceland. Iceland is relatively immune. As the glaciers melt, the crust underneath Iceland will actually rebound. So Iceland has the opposite problem. They're going to have not enough coastal water depth. So they're actually there are concerns that shipping will be impacted here in Iceland. And that crustal rebound will actually grow more intense as the Greenland ice sheet melts. Also, gravity is pulling water towards those ice sheets. Those ice sheets have mass. Gravity is pulling water towards them as the Iceland glaciers and the Greenland Great Glacier melt. That water will actually go to the rest of the globe. So Iceland doesn't confront challenges on sea level rise, but glaciers, which are an important aspect of Icelandic society, are going to disappear, are under threat. There are questions about the flora and fauna in the sea around Iceland, which is obviously extremely important for Iceland. But perhaps the most significant consequence for Iceland, as well as the other European Arctic states, is the potential collapse of the Atlantic meridional overturning current. So the European Arctic states have incredible vulnerabilities. That also, their size makes it such that they do not have what we might call climate strategic depth. I just made that term up just now, so you're welcome very much for that. The United States, China, Russia, Brazil, these are very large countries, not just in terms of population, but in terms of land mass. So the effects of climate change will be highly variable over those land masses, all obviously trending in the direction of warmer temperatures. But in the United States, for example, some places will get hotter and drier, but other places will get wetter as they get warmer. And so the consequences of that, you can see shifts in population within the United States that don't challenge the continued viability of the country. But in some place like Iceland, if the AMOC stops circulating, things are going to get pretty rough here, and there's not really any place to hide. Right, and that's similar for the other European Arctic states as well. Okay, so there are reasons to think that the Arctic states European Arctic states would be concerned about this. and would be interested in leveraging climate change and Arctic security questions into their foreign and security policy practices. So in order to try to assess whether this was happening, I already mentioned that I did interviews. I had 22 interviews in Finland. That was out of over 100 emails that I sent, so I had a roughly 20% success rate. I did have some pretty substantial individuals that I interviewed, a former prime minister, a former foreign minister, as well as many currently serving officials in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. It got to the point where I forgot my passport and they let me in anyway because they're like, "You're back again?" And I said, "Yes," and they said, "Fine." I also interviewed some officials and leaders of business organizations in Finland, and as well as members of non-governmental organizations. Now, you might say to yourselves, why are you talking to these people who have no knowledge about security and diplomatic practices of Finland? The reason for that is because a core premise of my argument, or what I think is going on, is the connection between international facing behavior and domestic politics. And so these members of the non-governmental organization sector give me some insight as to how those dynamics are playing out, dynamics around conceptions of the Arctic, beliefs about the nature of change in the Arctic, as well as how climate change is thought about, perceived, how those are being filtered through different sectors within society. And that matters. I found out that matters a lot in Finland. So in the case of Iceland, things are moving a little bit more slowly. I only have 4 interviews so far out of about 40 interview requests sent out, although my confirmed interviews, at least people who've agreed in principle to be interviewed, will also hit about that 20% success rate. So, okay. I did have a picture. You're welcome for this. This is the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Finland, and you can see that Ukraine had a very substantial impact there. It's had an impact here as well, but Finland, super big deal, and I'm going to talk about that in a second. Okay, so there, much to my surprise, there is very, very little discussion in either Finland or, to this point, in Iceland, of climate change or the Arctic in security terms. And this is surprising to me for a range of reasons. I've already outlined some of them, that there are very real geophysical challenges to these places if climate change proceeds on the trajectories that we are seeing. Security, from the standpoint of an international relations scholar, from a theoretical standpoint, security can do some things for you. So when you say X, Y, or Z is a security threat, that allows you to suspend normal politics within society. It allows you to accumulate power to yourself and allows you to undertake some exceptional measures in order to deal with the threat. Climate change is a very large problem that encompasses all sectors of society. And so if there was an issue area where you would really need to potentially overcome normal political practices and the inertia of those practices, this might be it. And I don't see any evidence of it. The foreign policy practitioners are not talking about security either internally or externally. So they're not going to their foreign interlocutors and they're not saying, hey, look, we are facing security threats from climate change. You really need to listen to us about these issues. They're just not doing it. Why is this the case? Well, in Finland, the Russian invasion displaced a lot of other security discourses. The Finns, not to put too fine a point on this, are really freaked out about it. The Ukrainian flag has been flying above the Helsinki train station for years now. It's not the Finnish flag, it's the Ukrainian flag. Volodymyr Zelensky was in Helsinki when I was there. I didn't get a chance to see him and give him my advice on anything just didn't work out scheduling wise. But it was a big deal. Like, it was as though pick your favorite celebrity was in your local hometown. There were people standing outside waiting to get a glimpse of him. There were the flags in front of the presidential residence and offices were Ukrainian flags. There were Ukrainian flags everywhere. Like, this guy was a rock star. So in Finland, the Russian security threat has pushed out everything else. So this might be a temporary displacement, although time will tell. Another aspect of what's going on in Finland is that Finns feel that they domestically have done a lot to deal with climate change. So there are some interesting parallels between Finland and Iceland. Finland does not have geothermal or hydroelectric, but they have a lot of nuclear power plants. So actually the Finnish electrical system is pretty carbon zero in terms of marginal kilowatt hour produced. So similar to Iceland in that regard. So Finland doesn't need to overhaul its electrical system. Where it does run short of electricity, it gets power from Norwegian hydroelectric resources. So Iceland or Finland, you see a lot of effort to electrify transportation. In Helsinki, every bus is electric, which is super cool because they're very quiet, and a lot of electric vehicles on the road. Where Finnish industry also deeply supports climate policy, because Finnish industry feels that it is a comparative advantage for them. They can sell alternative energy resources, expertise around the world. They can export the control systems and the information technology, et cetera. So Finland, as a relatively late modernizer, also like Iceland, has leapfrogged a lot of the older technologies that continue to hold us back in the United States, for example, and they now see it as an opportunity. So the politicians and policymakers in Finland don't have to convince their domestic public about the need or opportunity for climate change policy. Going outside, the Finnish policy practitioners expressed a lot of concern that they didn't think they could sell it as a security issue. Finland is vulnerable, especially if AMOC collapses. Sami populations in the north are suffering now. There are these mass reindeer die-offs. But it's really hard for the Finnish policymakers, foreign policy practitioners, to sell that as a security story in international fora, unfortunately for the Sami, right? But there's another issue here as well, which is that Finns understand that they're in the league of developed countries. And so arguments about climate vulnerability seem disjuncturous with their socioeconomic wealth. Okay, Iceland, I'm not really sure yet what's going on here. I've only had 4 interviews. Iceland has parallels with Finland, a very clean electrical system, increasing electric vehicle distribution. So Iceland, the few folks that I've talked to, same sense as Finland, we're doing our bit. We're very clean. We're on track. Nobody here really disagrees with climate policy, although it is interesting. One person pointed out to me that the Green Party is no longer in Parliament for some reason, so I'm looking forward to digging into as to what's going on there. But Iceland also, the suggestions I've gotten, some similarities. Increased emphasis on Iceland as a small country. I also saw that in Finland, but increased emphasis in Iceland that it's a small country. Okay, so some themes that have come out of the interviews. These are really questions that I hope to address in the book project. The question of agency. There is a real sense out of the interviews that countries, Finland and maybe we'll see in Iceland, are kind of preemptively disempowering themselves. What do I mean by this? Well, we're small countries, we're doing our bit. Even if we were to do more, it wouldn't have an impact. It doesn't really matter what we do. But that's belied by a tradition of small and medium-sized countries having real outsized impact on the international system. And here in Iceland is one of the archetypal examples, right? So some of you may not be aware, there's this UN Convention of the Law of the Sea, right? That was agreed. The United States, of course, has not signed it, but because we don't believe in international treaties, I guess. But the 200-mile exclusive economic zone, who came up with that? Iceland did, right? Iceland, this small country, big ocean, right? But small country pioneered the idea that states should have an exclusive economic zone that no other states can take advantage of. That is amazing, right? Every country that has signed on to UNCLOS, and it's most of them, that have that are littoral oceanic countries, are abiding by a rule that Iceland came up with, right? You know, if you're familiar with the Ottawa Convention, the landmine ban, which the Finns are unfortunately seeking that they may withdraw from because of the Russians, but Canada is not considered a large country, about 25 million people, and yet it is a medium-sized country that effected a ban on an entire class of ordnance, which is not something we've seen outside of chemical and biological weapons bans. So small and medium-sized countries can have an impact. So what is going on here? Why are these states that are vulnerable, that are wealthy, that could provide models for the rest of the world, preemptively disempowering themselves? That's one of my questions that I have that's come up. The logic of action. Security provides one logic of action. Economic cost-benefit analysis provides another logic of action. I have a colleague at the University of Massachusetts Lowell who argues that this approach, the neoliberal economic approach, is a disempowering one, because you essentially turn questions of climate change, which have moral, normative components to them, questions of obligations to future generations, turn them into oversimplified calculations of contemporary economic cost-benefit calculus. I do see this in Finland. I do see this in Iceland. And the question for me is, why is this the prevailing logic of action in these countries? And this filters into their international diplomacy. Coming back to this issue of we're developed countries, can we really make an argument about vulnerability? Yes, right? Because if you take it out of the cost-benefit calculus, then of course you can, because future Finns, future Icelanders are going to pay the price for contemporary policies. And these countries are not so wealthy, no country is actually so wealthy, that it can avoid the economic consequences of climate change, right? But you run into that roadblock if you stick with the economic cost-benefit calculus as a logical action. So why is this predominant, and what are the consequences of it? And then third, this question of uncertainty. So we see this this bandied about in the United States quite a bit, because in the United States, we have a much more significant divide between people who accept the climate science and people who reject the climate science. And the people who reject climate science, scientists aren't 100% sure that X, Y, and Z is going to happen in ABC timeline, things of those things of that sort. You don't see those dynamics playing out in Finland and Iceland, but there is still this uncertainty, right? I just ran into this in an interview I had yesterday with a fairly high-level official in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. When I asked about AMOC collapse, which it's hard to underline how deleterious that would be for Iceland. If you look at Iceland's latitude and you look at Iceland would be a little warmer than comparable Canadian or Russian latitudes, because it's still an island in the ocean, and the ocean will have heating effects for the island, but it would be extremely deleterious, to the point that another interview subject, also here in Iceland, raised the question of whether Icelandic society could survive if the AMOC collapses. But when I asked about AMOC, this individual said, well, we don't really know if it's going to happen, if it's not going to happen. That's strange to me, right? Why is that uncertainty someplace that you would take refuge in. And again, I cannot emphasize this enough. This was a very senior member of the foreign ministry. So that ambiguity, that uncertainty about AMOC is going to feed into Icelandic diplomacy around these issues. Because if you're not convinced that AMOC collapse is a very serious problem that is likely to occur, if you are taking refuge as an individual foreign policymaker in this uncertainty, that's going to come through in your foreign policy, that's going to come through in your guidance to other elected officials above you, right? So the prime minister, the foreign minister, et cetera. So how are these questions of uncertainty resolved, not resolved, and what is the consequence of those things? Okay, I think that was it for me. I don't know what how I did on time because I forgot to start my timer, but.
Yeah. Very interesting way to end our day. So it's a lot of yes.
Okay, I have a question about the limiting factors and like the thinking of the people that you interviewed.
Sure.
Because you mentioned the hyper focus on simple like cost benefit analysis.
Sure.
And also the overemphasis of like small uncertainties, like, oh, scientists don't know exactly when this is gonna happen or like how big it's gonna be. But I've been thinking about like the concept of geological thinking, like thinking like a geologist, thinking
Sure.
on long-term timescales,
Yeah.
and how that really affects how people think about the future and like what we should do now to like affect things in the future. And I'm wondering if you have considered interviewing any geologists.
I haven't. So number one, let me say, I absolutely agree with you. When I teach courses on global environmental policy at my home institution, I really work to drive home to my students that the civilization we have now is a product of an incredibly felicitous climatic condition, right? If you go back 10,000 years, my wife and I own a property in Maine. That property in Maine was under a mile of ice 10,000, 12,000 years ago. And in not just in geologic terms, but in terms of the existence of the human species, that is not very long.
Yeah.
And if you consider the mini ice age and the fact that the mini ice age basically had to end before human civilization could really take off, we're only talking about, a couple thousand years. So I completely agree with you, and I try to drive that home. The question from an interview methodology standpoint is interviewing geologists, that knowledge is only relevant insofar as it's influencing these people, right? Because these are the people who are going out and making the arguments, not only to their domestic populations, but also to their international interlocutors. And so if they're not using those arguments, from a policymaking standpoint, it doesn't matter. One of the other things that I didn't bring up is I talked to my interview subjects about the balance between their international diplomacy on these issues and domestic society. And even in Finland and Iceland, where there's widespread acceptance of the need for climate policy, there does not appear, at least from the standpoint of the practitioners, to be a lot of pressure on them to be out in the international system, pushing, advocating for more aggressive international climate action. So even if that geologic knowledge is present in the domestic context, for whatever reason, it's not filtering through to what these policymakers are doing. So that's where your question dovetails with the previous presentation about the nature of education, right? If kids are being exposed to this geologic kind of time frame, as well as how tenuous modern modern civilization is dependent on a particular configuration of climate, then that would shift, but that's not something that's within the purview of the work.
Right. Thanks.
Final session of the academic year. I think it was a great one. we're at the end of the program. I want to thank again everyone who attended and participated both in person and virtually. I hope you all enjoyed it as much as I did. We've heard from a wide spectrum of scholars, from cybersecurity to architecture, ecology, environmental science, political science, the teaching profession. How fortunate we have been to have you here in Iceland for this time. It's another example, I think, this afternoon of the important work that Fulbright does and foster, or actually not the work that Fulbright does, but more the work that Fulbright fosters in diverse areas of academia. How Fulbright is building bridges, invigorating teaching and research to make our planet safer, stronger, and better equipped to deal with, the challenges of our day. It's such a privilege to us here at the Commission to get to work with and foster all of you, such dedicated individuals and phenomenal scientists. I'm inspired certainly by all of you, and I'm sure that goes for everyone who's been listening today. For those of you who presented today, I just want to say that we look forward to staying in touch with you after you leave Iceland. We hope that you're going to stay connected to the Fulbright Iceland Commission. And as I said on Monday, I want to say again, you're our most valuable asset. So we hope that when you return home, you will continue to be champions of the Fulbright program, of Fulbright Iceland in particular, and that we will hear from you often, and that you'll stay connected. Thank you again for all of your hard work over these past months. One more final round of applause. Again, this is our last forum of this academic year. We're going to invite those of you who are here with us in person to have a celebratory drink out in the other room. And again, thank you to those who tuned in or attended in person. We look forward to connecting with you again in the coming academic year. And until then, let us continue to forge a better future with Fulbright.